Hello everybody and welcome to the first lecture in our series of Principles and Practice, the first module which will contribute to your becoming a professional translator. Today's lecture concerns functionalism, and functionalism is about the practice of translation in the real world. It is therefore the basis of every translation curriculum, in which you are learning the core skills needed by translators when facing a translation job. Functionalism was developed in the 1970s and 80s by a group of German scholars and marked an important development in the field of translation studies by moving the discipline away from linguistic theories of translation and focusing instead on what actually drives translation in practice. We'll be returning to this development, this shift, in Unit 3 when we discuss the concept of equivalence, which dominated theorizations of translation before the advent of functional approaches. But suffice it to say at this point that functionalism offers clear solutions to what practicing translators face on a day-to-day basis. Indeed, all experienced translators have an innate sense of how the functions of the source text that they're working with and the intended functions of the target texts govern and shape the form a translation takes. It is worth considering the terminology I've just used, that of source text and target text, as these terms indeed encapsulate the core notion that underlies functional approaches to translation. Why might the terms original and translation have given way to these terms, source text and target text? Well, North says, and I quote from one of the readings you've been given, that the function of a translation is not arrived at automatically from an analysis of the source text, but is pragmatically defined by the purpose of the intercultural communication. Let's unpack this quote in terms of the difference between the words original and translation versus source text and target text. The terms original and translation are loaded with implications which, on the one hand, concern an assumed hierarchical relationship between texts, which sees translations as the fallen shadows of original texts, by their very nature secondary, derivative, inferior, even potentially subversive and dangerous. Hence the old Italian adage, traduttore traditore, translator, traitor, and the idea of les belles infidèles, which, in a rather sexist way, implies that translations, like women, can either be beautiful or faithful, but not both. In addition, the terms original and translation evoke the linguistic approaches to translation based on equivalence, as if to suggest that originals exist in some sort of ontological relationship of correspondence with their translations, where there is an equivalent serving for all times and in all places. There is an almost theological or perhaps Platonic bent to this kind of thinking, perhaps deriving from issues relating to the translation of sacred texts and high-status literature, or indeed to the romantic cult of genius. Anyway, this is not our subject matter per se at this moment. If you want to find out more about those things, let's start a forum discussion. But at least in the case of the vast bulk of translations that do occur in the real world, what we call operative texts are what are concerned. These are texts that are written with a specific and concrete purpose in mind, to operate within and bear results in our material, political, and cultural economy. This one-to-oneness cannot hold. Putting paid to this idea is the reason why Mona Baker, in her book, In Other Words, One of Your Prescribed Texts, a text also clearly concerned with methodological as opposed to philosophical concerns in translation, chooses to cite color at the very outset of her second chapter. He says, if language was simply a nomenclature for a set of universal concepts, it would be easy to translate from one language to another. One would simply replace the French name of a concept with the English name. If language were like this, the task of learning a new language would also be much easier than it is. But anyone who has attempted either of these tasks has acquired, alas, a vast amount of direct proof that languages are not nomenclatures, that the concepts of one language may differ radically from those of another. Each language articulates or organizes the world differently. Languages do not simply name existing categories, they articulate their own. So coming back to the quote by Naut, that the function of a translation is not arrived at automatically from an analysis of the source text, but is pragmatically defined by the purpose of the intercultural communication, we see that she's contrasting this notion of one-to-oneness in translation, which she casts in the terms of arriving automatically from an analysis of the source text, with a more functional approach in which the function and consequently the form and shape of the eventual translation is rather pragmatically defined by the purpose of the translation. For example, let's take the case of a guidebook written in Portuguese and to be translated into English. The guidebook to Lisbon. This guidebook would differ markedly if the audience were specifically British, American, Australian, South African, not least because of superficial differences such as currency conversions, the Fahrenheit and Celsius, the availability and cost of flights, American versus UK spelling, but on a deeper structural level of how texts are organized for maximum effect, reflecting the presumed knowledge of the respective audiences about Portugal, different registers or styles considered appropriate to the text type in question in those various contexts. As Naut says, text type conventions are not universal, but are rather linked to a certain culture at a certain time. These are all considerations that functionalism takes into account. Essentially, the translator asks him or herself what the intended purpose of the text is in the target culture. It might be the same as the source culture, but it might well be different. And he or she must ask herself or himself how to adapt the text so that it performs that function once it has been translated. Coming back to the original question then regarding why we opt for source text as opposed to original and target text as opposed to translation, these words are far more neutral. They imply nothing insofar as the status of the respective texts are concerned. They acknowledge that source texts are simply that, the raw material of the target text, with specific purposes. Target implies direction. It also implies purpose. Our aim when translating is to hit the target, which means producing a text that works as it is intended in the receiving culture. Bringing the discussion back down to earth perhaps, in real and pragmatic terms, how do we ascertain what this target or purpose, or Vermeer uses the Greek word skopos, might be? Naut says that the translator's reception, the way he or she receives the text, is determined by the communicative needs of the initiator of the target text. So the person who wants the text defines the intended purpose of the translation for the translator so that he or she can produce an optimally functional text. Who is the initiator? The word used by Naut. We might typically say client. And how does the client specify what the purpose of the translation is? This happens by means of a brief. A brief is essentially a set of instructions for the translator, which ideally should explain where and when the text will be published, to what end, and by whom it will be read, and for what purpose. The more detailed the brief, the better. But that said, experienced translators, used to their language combinations and the source and target cultures in which they work, most often have an implicit sense of what needs to be done when given a translation to do. We might simply ask the client, what is this for and who will be reading it? The details of the brief are then extrapolated from the text itself and from the basic instructions given by the client into a more elaborate sense of where to go and what to do. And this all happens in the mind of the translator very often. This, however, comes with experience and is the result of a lot of reading of a lot of different types of texts. That's why you must become voracious readers if you're not already. And I don't mean just important stuff like literature and your readings and your textbooks and what have you. I mean everything. Like a chameleon, a translator has to mimic different styles and registers every day. And for this reason, the more exposure to texts of all kinds, the better. You should read critically and carefully, not so much for the content, but for form. How is the language used, and to what effect? What words and tones of phrase are typical to this or that genre, or to this or that specific type of discourse? How do politicians write and say their speeches to convince people that they're correct? How do medical professionals write papers to ensure that they are clear and neutral and targeted, etc., etc.? How will you be reading through? Now you'll be reading through the textbook chapter and some texts. My intention with these videos is not to belabor the concepts in the readings. I'd much rather we make use of the forums to discuss definitions and concepts and the like. But I do want to handle one more fundamental question here regarding functionalism. You may have said to yourself, hang on, where does this all leave the source text writer? Is functionalism an ethical approach? Does this mean we can just say anything in his or her name? Not does deal with this in her work. Now you remember we spoke about les belles infidèles and the notion of faithfulness. When people speak about translation, they often speak of faithfulness, a faithful translation. And in this sense, they are referring to the form of the translation, the words used, and the order they come in, and how these directly affect the meaning. For not what matters in functionalism is not this formal notion, but rather an ethical obligation. The ethic that tempers functional approaches to translation is that we must never falsify or misrepresent the intention of the source text author, or his or her character, nor terms this ethical obligation as loyalty. Another concern: what if we actually want a literal translation? Or what if we are translating something like literature, where the source language and culture matter to the target reader? For example, when we buy a Samsung TV and we open the instruction booklet, we honestly couldn't care less whether the manual was originally produced in Korean or not. It's not relevant to our purposes. Indeed, by definition, a badly translated manual from, say, Chinese might frustrate our attempts to use the product effectively. Here, bad in bad translation means too literal, because we find it useless from a practical or utilitarian approach. Hence, it hasn't achieved its function. But what if we are reading a Korean novel or a Chinese poem in translation? Here we want to get a sense, at least, of what the original was like, how the words were used, what symbols and metaphors were employed, even if they are strange and foreign to our ear. This experience of the foreign and the unknown is what delights us when we read foreign literature. Now, Nort has an answer for this too, and it does not contradict functionalism. She suggests that in the former case, that of a manual, for example, a translation approach called an instrumental translation should be employed. Here, the target text is meant to operate as a standalone product in the target culture. The relationship of an instrumental text to a source text is unimportant to the target reader. It doesn't matter that there was a Portuguese version of the guidebook to the English reader. as long as they find it useful in finding their way around Lisbon. Juliana House refers to this as a covert translation. The status of the text as a translation is unknown to the target reader. In contrast, a Korean novel is a category of text where the target reader is both aware of the status of the text as a translation. House calls this overt translation. And the reader is actively interested in gaining access to the original language and culture through the translation. Lay people often refer to words like local flavor or the spirit of a text or a book. I don't favor these terms because they're impossibly vague, but you catch my drift. In this case, the scopus, or the purpose of the target text, is precisely to act as some sort of conduit for the source text into the target language. These sorts of texts might necessitate what North calls a documentary translation. As implied by the term, these types of translations serve to document the existence and form of a prior text. There are a number of types of both instrumental and documentary translation that North enumerates and suggests are appropriate for different types of texts or different scopoi. But I'll let you deal with those in your readings, as they don't make for the most scintillating conversation. But to close this lecture, I'd like to look at some key questions that can help you guide your translation every time you get an assignment and when you hit the real world and start working as a translator. And these key questions are: what is the purpose of the target text? And how will my translation reflect this? Another one: for whom and where will the target text be published? And how will my translation reflect this? What is the most appropriate style for the target text, taking into account its function, audience, and setting? To what extent do I need to modify the style of the source text to reflect the target text needs? How does the source author feel about the subject? Here, loyalty matters. What impact does the author intend to have on the attitude of his or her own audience? Is it the desired effect to transmit the same impact in the target text? And if so, how? Again, here loyalty will come in. Right, I think we'll close here. I hope you found the first lecture illuminating and are excited for the readings and the tasks which will follow and form part of this unit. You can refer to the next video for some instructions and guidance about where to go next. Thank you.